"Dad is such an unbearable burden." My son said those words to his wife while I sat right there at the restaurant table I was paying for. Every father knows that moment when your child sees you as a failure, but this was different. This was public execution disguised as family lunch. 43 years I spent building a fortune for this family, and my own son was discussing me like I was already dead. That night, I made one phone call to my attorney. The next morning, I showed up at his door with legal papers that would change everything. My name is Walter Harrison, and this is how one devastating sentence led me to teach my son the most expensive lesson about respect he'd ever receive. Before I tell you how those legal documents shattered his world and rebuilt ours, hit that subscribe button and share this with any parent who's ever felt invisible to their own children. Because what happened next taught us both that love and respect aren't the same thing, and sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what family really means. The hardest part isn't the insult, it's the silence that follows. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my coffee growing cold while my son and daughter-in-law continued their conversation as if I had simply vanished from the table. They discussed vacation plans, work schedules, their mortgage, life flowing around me like water around a stone. I wanted to stand up, to say something, anything that would restore my dignity, but 43 years of being a provider had taught me that sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. The waitress approached our table twice, probably sensing the tension thick as morning fog. Each time, I nodded politely and asked for more time, though time was the last thing I needed. Time to process that my own flesh and blood saw me as dead weight. Time to understand how the man who had sacrificed everything for his family's future had become nothing more than an inconvenience in their present. Michael, my son, had always been articulate, even as a child. I remembered helping him with debate club in high school, so proud of his sharp mind and quick tongue. But never did I imagine that same tongue would one day slice through my heart with surgical precision.
Unbearable burden.
The words echoed in my head like a death sentence being read aloud in a courtroom. Jennifer, his wife, had nodded in agreement. Not enthusiastic agreement, but that subtle acknowledgement that married couples develop when they've discussed something privately many times before. This wasn't a spontaneous comment born from frustration. This was a calculated assessment they'd made together, probably over dinner at their beautiful suburban home that I'd helped them buy. I thought about my late wife, Margaret, and wondered if she could see this moment from wherever she was now. Would she be proud of the man our son had become? Would she understand why I stayed silent, or would she have reached across that table and reminded Michael exactly who had made his comfortable life possible? Margaret always said I was too gentle for my own good, that my kindness would be mistaken for weakness someday. Sitting in that restaurant, listening to my son dismiss 4 decades of sacrifice, I realized she'd been prophetic. The check came, and I paid it without ceremony. $97 for lunch and the most expensive lesson about family dynamics I'd ever received. Michael didn't even reach for his wallet. After calling me a burden, he still expected me to pick up the tab. The irony wasn't lost on me, though I suspect it was completely invisible to him. As we walked to our cars, he actually patted my shoulder and said, "Thanks for lunch, Dad. We should do this more often." Driving home alone, I realized something had broken inside me that afternoon. Not my love for my son, that would always remain intact, but my willingness to accept disrespect disguised as family obligation. I'd spent decades building financial security for people who saw my presence as a burden rather than a blessing. Every parent knows the feeling of being taken for granted, but this was different. This was being told you're actively unwelcome in the life you spent 40 years creating. That evening, I sat in my study surrounded by photo albums and legal documents, trying to reconcile the smiling boy in graduation pictures with the man who'd publicly dismissed me hours earlier. Somewhere between teaching him to ride a bike and watching him buy his first house, I'd transformed from his hero into his burden. The transition had been so gradual I'd missed it entirely, like watching a sunset in slow motion until suddenly you're sitting in complete darkness. I built this town brick by brick, but couldn't build my son's respect. Standing in my garage at midnight, I pulled out a dusty cardboard box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were photographs from 1979, the groundbreaking ceremony for Harrison Plaza, the first shopping center I developed in Cedar Falls. There I was, 34 years old with dirt under my fingernails and dreams bigger than my bank account, shaking hands with the mayor while Michael, barely 5, tugged at my work boots. That shopping center started with a handshake loan from Pete Kowalski at First National Bank. $5,000 and a prayer, as Pete used to say. I remember the night before construction began, walking the empty lot with Margaret, both of us wondering if we were crazy to mortgage our house for a business venture nobody believed would succeed. "Walt," she'd said, squeezing my calloused hand, "win or lose, Michael will be proud of his daddy's courage." How wrong we both were about that. The early years were brutal in ways that success stories never capture. I'd work construction jobs during the day to keep money coming in, then spend evenings and weekends developing my first properties. Michael would sometimes ride with me to job sites, perched on the passenger seat of my old Ford pickup, asking endless questions about why buildings looked the way they did. I'd explain load-bearing walls and foundation principles to a 6-year-old who listened like every word was gospel. Back then, I was his walking encyclopedia of everything interesting about the world. By 1985, Harrison Development had grown from that single shopping center to 12 commercial properties across 3 counties. The local newspaper ran a feature story calling me Indiana's silent success story, because I'd never advertised, never promoted myself, just quietly accumulated real estate while other developers made noise and eventually went bankrupt. I kept that newspaper clipping in my wallet for 20 years, thinking someday Michael would read it and understand what his father had accomplished. The sacrifice wasn't just financial. It was everything else that makes a life worth living. Little league games I missed because tenants called with emergencies. Family vacations postponed because construction delays meant I needed to be on site. Birthday parties I attended but wasn't really present for, my mind calculating costs and schedules while my son blew out candles and wondered why Daddy always looked worried. But every missed dinner, every weekend spent reviewing contracts instead of playing catch, every holiday cut short by business calls, it all had a purpose.
Michael S. College fund grew steadily.
His dental work, his music lessons, his summer camps, his eventual law school tuition. None of it ever caused our family financial stress because I'd built something bigger than our immediate needs. While other parents argued about money, Margaret and I never had that conversation. Not once.
The irony cuts deepest when you remember how proud Michael used to be.
In high school, he'd bring friends by my office, pointing to architectural blueprints and land surveys like they were family treasures. "My dad built most of downtown," he'd tell them, and I'd see genuine admiration in his eyes. During his senior year, he even wrote his college application essay about growing up watching his father transform empty lots into community gathering places. I helped him edit that essay, never imagining it would become the last time he'd speak about me with anything resembling pride. Somewhere between his graduation from Indiana University and his wedding day, I transformed from the man who made his dreams possible into the man who somehow stood in the way of them. Maybe it was marriage that changed his perspective. Jennifer came from old money, the kind of family that inherited wealth rather than building it. Perhaps my blue-collar origins embarrassed him in social circles where business cards mattered more than business results. Or maybe it was simply that success, once achieved, makes its origins seem less impressive. When you've never worried about mortgage payments because your father guaranteed you wouldn't, it becomes easy to forget that such security doesn't happen by accident. When your education never created debt because someone else planned for that expense decades in advance, the sacrifice behind that planning becomes invisible. Looking through those photographs at midnight, I realized something that should have been obvious years earlier. Respect isn't inherited like eye color or height. It's earned fresh in every generation, and somehow I'd stopped earning my son's respect while I was busy earning his future. The foundation I'd built for his life was so solid he couldn't even see it anymore, like groundwork, essential but buried, forgotten the moment the visible structure takes shape above it. I gave him everything I never had, except the one thing he needed most, the struggle that builds character. Michael Harrison, Esquire, as his business cards proudly proclaimed, graduated summa cum laude from Indiana University's law school in 1998, landed a position at Henderson, Matthews and Associates within 6 months, and by age 35 had made partner in Indianapolis's most prestigious corporate law firm. On paper, he was everything I dreamed my son would become: educated, successful, financially secure, married to a beautiful woman from a respected family, living in a colonial revival house in Carmel's most exclusive neighborhood. What I hadn't anticipated was that in giving him everything I never had, I'd robbed him of everything that made me who I was. While I'd spent my youth learning that respect must be earned through sweat, sacrifice, and perseverance, Michael had grown up in a world where respect seemed to flow automatically from credentials, titles, and social connections. His law office occupied the 32nd floor of Chase Tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city skyline that included buildings I'd developed decades earlier, though he'd never once acknowledged that connection to his colleagues. During his wedding reception at the Indianapolis Country Club, an event I'd proudly funded entirely, I overheard him telling Jennifer's family about his self-made success, describing his career trajectory without mentioning the college fund that eliminated student debt, the unpaid internships he could afford because his housing was covered, or the professional networking events he attended wearing suits I'd purchased. It wasn't malicious omission. He genuinely seemed to believe his achievements were entirely his own, the way someone born into privilege often mistakes advantages for personal virtue. The tragic irony was that I'd succeeded too well as a father. By removing every obstacle from his path, I deprived him of the very struggles that would have taught him to value the sacrifices others made on his behalf. When Henderson, Matthews and Associates celebrated his partnership with a reception at the Columbia Club, he gave a speech thanking his mentors, his colleagues, his law school professors, even his wife's family for their unwavering support and guidance. But when he mentioned his parents, it was a perfunctory, and of course my parents, who always believed in me. Always believed. As if belief was the extent of our contribution, as if 40 years of 18-hour workdays and calculated financial risks were merely emotional cheerleading rather than the concrete foundation that made his entire trajectory possible. Jennifer had been raised in old Indianapolis money. Her grandfather had been a federal judge, her father was a prominent surgeon, her mother served on museum boards and charity committees, and in her family, success was expected rather than celebrated because it was assumed rather than fought for. Michael adapted to their world seamlessly, perhaps too seamlessly, adopting their casual relationship with privilege and their unconscious dismissal of anyone whose success looked different from their inherited patterns. At family gatherings, I'd watch him navigate conversations about private school rankings, vacation home purchases, and country club politics with the fluency of someone born to those discussions, and while part of me felt proud that he belonged in circles I'd never been invited to join, another part grieved for the boy who used to ask me why concrete trucks had those spinning drums and whether he could drive one someday. The transformation had been so gradual I'd missed the moment when my son stopped seeing me as the man who made his world possible and started seeing me as the rough edges he'd transcended through education and social climbing. Success, I realized too late, can be its own prison when it separates you from understanding the source of your opportunities, and in giving Michael everything I'd never had, I'd inadvertently taught him that everything he had was somehow his natural birthright rather than the culmination of someone else's lifetime of deliberate choices and willing sacrifices. Sometimes love means swallowing your pride until it chokes you, and that Tuesday night after the restaurant humiliation, I sat alone in Margaret's old sewing room wondering if 43 years of swallowing had finally killed something essential inside me. The room still smelled faintly of her lavender sachets, still held her presence in ways that both comforted and tormented me. Her reading glasses folded on the windowsill, her bookmark still marking page 247 of a novel she'd never finish, her coffee mug with the chip on the handle that I couldn't bring myself to throw away even 3 years after the funeral. I'd moved into this smaller room after she died, unable to sleep in our master bedroom where her absence felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest, and tonight the walls seemed to close in as I replayed Michael's words over and over like a prosecution attorney reviewing damning evidence. Unbearable burden. The phrase had lodged itself in my consciousness like a splinter, infected and throbbing, impossible to ignore or extract. I tried to rationalize his comment, searching for alternative interpretations the way a defense lawyer hunts for reasonable doubt. Maybe he'd meant financial burden, though my accountant had assured me repeatedly that my estate planning would leave him wealthier than he'd ever need to be. Maybe he'd meant emotional burden, though I'd made it my practice never to complain about my arthritis or my loneliness or the way grocery shopping for one person made me feel like I was practicing for my own funeral. Maybe he'd meant social burden, though I'd always dressed appropriately for family gatherings and kept my stories brief and my opinions to myself when conversation turned to topics outside my expertise. But no amount of mental gymnastics could soften the brutal clarity of what I'd witnessed. My son discussing my existence like a problem to be managed rather than a relationship to be cherished. His wife nodding along with the casual agreement that comes from repeated private conversations about how to minimize my presence in their lives. The worst part wasn't the insult itself, but the realization that it represented their settled opinion rather than a moment of frustration, their considered judgment rather than heat-of-the-moment cruelty. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through text messages from the past 6 months, looking for evidence that might contradict what I'd heard, but the pattern was undeniable. My initiations of contact were met with polite but brief responses, my invitations to dinner were accepted reluctantly and rescheduled frequently. My attempts to share good news about property investments or community recognition were acknowledged with the same enthusiasm most people reserve for discussing weather patterns. When had I become such an imposition on the family I'd spent my entire adult life serving? When had my love transformed from a source of strength into a source of obligation? Margaret used to say that parenthood was the only relationship where success meant working yourself out of a job, where the goal was raising children independent enough to not need you anymore, but she'd always imagined that independence would coexist with affection rather than replace it entirely. Sitting in her chair, surrounded by the quiet desperation of a widower's evening routine, I understood something that successful parenting guides never mention. Sometimes you can do everything right and still end up exactly where you feared you'd be, alone, unwanted, counting down days until you become your children's inheritance problem rather than their living father. The silence in that room was different from ordinary quiet. It was the sound of realizing that your most important relationship had died without you noticing, the way a tree can be hollow for years before the wind finally knocks it down, leaving everyone surprised by how little was actually holding it up all along. Death by 1,000 cuts. That's how family disappointment works, and sitting there in the darkness I could trace the precise timeline of when my son's love transformed into polite tolerance and eventually calcified into barely concealed resentment. It started small, the way cancer begins with a single corrupted cell that seems harmless until you realize it's been metastasizing for years without symptoms dramatic enough to demand attention. The first cut came during his law school graduation dinner in 1998, when I mentioned being proud that Harrison Development had been featured in Midwest Real Estate Monthly, and Michael actually rolled his eyes before saying, "Dad, nobody here cares about strip mall development," his tone carrying the dismissive patience adults use with children who interrupt grown-up conversations with irrelevant observations. The second cut arrived at his wedding rehearsal dinner, when Jennifer's father asked about my background and Michael answered for me before I could speak, describing me as semi-retired from small-time construction, a description so reductive it made 40 years of building a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate portfolio sound like hobby woodworking in someone's garage. The cuts multiplied during his early marriage years, the Christmas when he opened my gift of a first edition book about Indiana architecture and said, "Thanks, Dad, I'll add it to the collection," though I knew he'd never owned any books about architecture and suspected this one would disappear into a closet within a week. The Easter dinner when I offered to help him refinance his mortgage at better terms through my banking connections, and he replied, "We're handling our finances ourselves now." As if my suggestion represented interference rather than assistance from someone who'd been navigating complex real estate transactions since before he was born. The Thanksgiving when I mentioned that Harrison Development had been approached about selling several properties to a national retail chain, and he changed the subject so abruptly it felt like being slapped for speaking out of turn. Each incident was individually defensible. He was establishing independence, asserting his professional identity, creating boundaries appropriate for a married man. But collectively they formed a pattern of systematic diminishment that transformed every family gathering into a minefield where my contributions to conversation were either ignored, corrected, or redirected toward safer topics that didn't risk reminding anyone that his father had achieved something worth mentioning. The cuts became deeper after Jennifer's father retired from surgery and began attending more family functions, bringing with him the casual superiority of someone whose success had always been socially prestigious rather than merely financially substantial. Dr. Morrison had a gift for asking questions designed to highlight the differences between his family's refined accomplishments and my blue-collar origins, inquiring about my education when he already knew I'd never attended college, asking about my investment strategy when he understood perfectly well that my wealth came from buying land and building on it rather than manipulating stock portfolios, wondering aloud whether people in development faced the same regulatory challenges as professionals in medicine, as if constructing buildings required less expertise than writing prescriptions. Michael never defended me during these conversations, never redirected them toward more neutral territory, never acknowledged that his father's lack of formal credentials hadn't prevented him from building a business empire that dwarfed most people's lifetime earnings. Instead, he seemed to retreat into embarrassed silence, the way teenagers do when their parents say something that threatens their social standing among peers whose approval matters more than family loyalty. The pattern reached its crescendo during his partnership celebration at the Columbia Club, when he delivered that speech thanking everyone except the person whose decades of sacrifice had made his entire career trajectory possible, and I realized that my transformation from hero to burden was complete. I'd become the family member they acknowledged dutifully but hoped wouldn't say much, the relative whose presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, the father whose love had somehow become indistinguishable from obligation in the mind of the son who'd once thought I could build anything, fix anything, accomplish anything worth accomplishing in a world full of endless possibility. I built wealth in silence because love shouldn't need to prove itself, but that night I opened my private safe and confronted the full magnitude of what my unbearable burden status actually meant in numerical terms that would make my son's partnership salary look like pocket change from a childhood allowance. The document spread across Margaret's old sewing table told a story Michael had never bothered to ask about. Harrison Development wasn't the small-time operation he'd described to his in-laws, but a diversified real estate empire that owned 47 commercial properties across 6 states, including the office building where his own law firm leased space for $31,000 per month without realizing they were paying rent to the father one of their partners considered worthless. The portfolio summary showed $47 million in current property values, generating $2.8 million annually in rental income, with expansion plans that would double those numbers within 5 years if the Indianapolis Airport Development Project proceeded as expected. Beyond real estate, my investment accounts held another $12 million in carefully selected blue-chip stocks, municipal bonds, and index funds, the kind of conservative wealth-building strategy that financial advisors recommend to clients who've already achieved more money than they can spend in a lifetime and now focus on preserving capital for future generations who may or may not deserve their inheritance. The irony cut deeper than any insult. Michael worked 60-hour weeks to earn his $340,000 annual salary while his burden of a father generated more than 8 times that amount through passive income from investments he'd built through 5 decades of calculated risks and delayed gratification. I'd kept this information private not from shame or false modesty, but from a deliberate philosophy that Margaret and I had developed during the early years of building our fortune. We believed that children should understand work ethic and personal responsibility before they understood trust funds and guaranteed inheritances, that they should develop their own sense of purpose before discovering they'd never need to worry about money again. The strategy had worked, perhaps too well. Michael had indeed developed a strong work ethic and achieved genuine professional success, but he'd also developed the pride that comes from believing your accomplishments are entirely self-generated rather than built upon a foundation of unprecedented financial security that few people his age could imagine. My lawyer, James Patterson, had structured the business entities through multiple LLCs and trusts specifically to maintain privacy while maximizing tax efficiency. Harrison Development LLC, Midwest Properties Trust, Cedar Falls Holdings Corporation. A labyrinth of legal entities that kept my name out of public records while ensuring that every major commercial development in our region generated revenue streams that would continue flowing long after I was gone. The cruel mathematics of family dynamics meant that the man Michael saw as an embarrassing remnant of his blue-collar past was actually the silent financial architect of his family's entire lifestyle, the college fund that eliminated his student debt, the down payment assistance that bought his first house, the wedding expenses that turned his marriage into a country club showcase, The emergency fund that covered Jennifer's medical bills when she had complications during their miscarriage. Even the lease payments on his BMW and her Mercedes were indirectly subsidized by rental income from properties whose ownership he'd never thought to investigate. I'd been writing checks behind the scenes for 20 years, covering everything from property taxes on their Carmel house to private school tuition for their neighbors' children, when Michael and Jennifer wanted to maintain social standing in a community where educational excellence was assumed rather than achieved through sacrifice. The most painful irony was that I'd structured my entire financial strategy around creating generational wealth that would allow Michael's children to grow up with advantages I'd never had, while my own son had grown up to see me as nothing more than an aging inconvenience who required management rather than respect. Completely unaware that his comfortable existence was entirely dependent on the continued success of businesses he dismissed as small-time construction whenever anyone asked about his father's career.
Every parent has a nightmare. Did uno fail the person uno love most?
The question haunted me as I stood at my kitchen window at 3 a.m, staring out at the mature oak trees I'd planted when Michael was 7, watching their branches sway in the Indiana wind while I tried to trace the exact moment when unconditional love transformed into conditional tolerance in my son's heart. The trees had grown tall and strong, their root systems now deep enough to weather any storm, but somehow the relationship I'd tended with equal care had withered despite decades of consistent nurturing, leaving me to wonder whether the problem was my technique or the soil itself. I'd followed every parenting philosophy available to a working father in the 1980s and 90s, provided financial security without spoiling him, encouraged independence without abandoning him, supported his dreams without imposing my own, maintained discipline without crushing his spirit. Yet somewhere in the execution of these well-intentioned strategies, I'd apparently raised a man who saw his father as an obstacle to overcome rather than a foundation to build upon. The self-examination was brutal in its honesty. Had I been too absent during his childhood, too focused on building wealth for his future to be present for his daily struggles with homework, friendships, and teenage insecurities? Margaret had handled most of the emotional labor of parenting while I handled the financial responsibilities, a division of duties that seemed logical at the time, but now looked like I'd outsourced the relationship-building aspects of fatherhood to my wife while claiming credit for the security her efforts had made possible. Or maybe I'd been too present, too eager to solve his problems before he could develop resilience, too quick to write checks when he should have learned to work for what he wanted, too protective in ways that prevented him from appreciating the harsh realities that build character and gratitude in equal measure. The paradox of successful parenting gnawed at me. You work tirelessly to give your children better lives than you had, but in succeeding at that goal, you risk raising people who can't understand the value of what they've received because they've never experienced life without it. I thought about my own father, a steelworker who died at 58 from lung disease contracted in the foundries of Gary, Indiana, leaving behind medical bills that wiped out our family's savings and forced me to work construction jobs while attending community college at night. Dad never had the luxury of wondering whether he'd failed me as a father. He was too busy working double shifts to keep food on our table and a roof over our heads, but I'd always known he loved me because his sacrifice was visible, immediate, and daily. My sacrifice for Michael had been different, more strategic, less obvious, designed to eliminate the financial stress that had dominated my childhood. But perhaps in making his path smooth, I'd made my contributions invisible, the way a good foundation disappears beneath the structure it supports. The cruelest possibility was that I'd succeeded too completely as a provider and failed entirely as a relationship model, teaching Michael that fathers were ATMs with advice functions rather than complex human beings deserving of respect and affection independent of their utility. Maybe my mistake was never allowing him to see me struggle, never sharing the anxiety that kept me awake during economic downturns, never explaining the personal cost of building wealth in a competitive industry where one bad decision could destroy decades of careful planning. I'd wanted to protect him from the fear and uncertainty that had motivated my own ambition, but protection can become isolation when it prevents children from understanding their parents as three-dimensional people with dreams, fears, and limitations worthy of empathy. Standing there in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by the comfortable silence of a house built with money Michael didn't know I had, I faced the devastating possibility that in trying to be the father I'd never had, I'd failed to be the father he actually needed. Someone who demanded respect as well as offering love, someone who shared struggles as well as solutions. Someone who modeled vulnerability alongside strength so that his son could learn to value both qualities in the relationships that would define his own adult life. Pride isn't about ego, it's about the respect you thought you earned, and sitting in that upscale bistro on Tuesday afternoon, I realized that 43 years of earning meant absolutely nothing to the person whose respect mattered most in the world. The restaurant was my choice, a place called Meridian Commons that I'd selected specifically because it was sophisticated enough to make Jennifer comfortable but not so pretentious that Michael would feel I was trying to show off, the kind of careful calculation that had become second nature after years of navigating the social landmines that separated my blue-collar origins from my son's professional aspirations. I'd arrived early, as always, choosing a corner table where we could talk privately without being overheard by other diners, ordering coffee I didn't really want because sitting empty-handed made me feel awkward in restaurants where the waitstaff clearly earned more education than I'd ever received. Michael and Jennifer arrived 15 minutes late, which had become their standard operating procedure for family meals, a subtle power dynamic that established their time as more valuable than mine without anyone having to acknowledge the hierarchy explicitly. The conversation started normally enough, Jennifer describing her new position at the art museum, Michael complaining about a difficult client who demanded unrealistic contract modifications, me listening attentively and asking appropriate questions while mentally calculating that their combined monthly expenses exceeded what most families in Cedar Falls earned in an entire year. But something shifted when Jennifer excused herself to take a phone call, leaving Michael and me alone at the table for the first time in months, and instead of using the privacy to connect with his father, he immediately pulled out his phone and began scrolling through messages with the mechanical attention of someone filling time until a more interesting person returned. I tried to bridge the gap by mentioning that Harrison Development had been approached about a major expansion project that would create jobs for local contractors, thinking he might be interested in the economic impact on our community, but he responded without looking up from his screen, "That's nice, Dad," in the tone people use when they're not actually listening but want to avoid the effort of admitting their distraction. When Jennifer returned, she was clearly frustrated by whatever phone conversation she'd finished, and Michael immediately shifted into supportive husband mode, asking concerned questions about her work situation while completely ignoring the fact that his father had been attempting to share significant news about a business development that would affect hundreds of local families. The final blow came when Jennifer, still agitated from her call, began venting about her supervisor's unreasonable demands, and Michael responded by saying, "I know exactly what you mean. Dealing with people who don't understand boundaries or appropriate professional behavior is exhausting," then glanced meaningfully in my direction before adding, "It's like my dad. He doesn't realize that calling during business hours to tell me about strip mall developments isn't really appropriate when I'm trying to focus on actual legal work." The words hung in the air for a moment before Jennifer, perhaps recognizing that she'd become an unwitting accomplice to public humiliation, tried to change the subject, but Michael continued as if I weren't sitting 3 feet away. "Honestly, sometimes I feel like he's become such an unbearable burden, always trying to insert himself into conversations about things he doesn't understand, always expecting us to be impressed by small-town business deals that wouldn't matter to anyone outside of
Cedar Falls."
The restaurant noise, clinking silverware, muted conversations, the espresso machine's mechanical hissing, seemed to fade into absolute silence as I processed the reality that my son was discussing my existence like a problem to be managed rather than a relationship to be honored, speaking about me in the third person while I sat close enough to see the contempt in his eyes. I'd been reduced to a case study in generational embarrassment, a cautionary tale about fathers who outlive their usefulness and become inconvenient reminders of humble origins that successful children prefer to minimize or forget entirely. And the most devastating part wasn't the cruelty of his words but the casual certainty with which he delivered them. As if my worthlessness was so obvious it barely merited discussion. Sometimes teaching requires breaking before rebuilding, and driving home from that restaurant in absolute silence, I understood that words had failed where actions might still succeed in reaching the man my son had become despite everything I'd tried to teach him about respect, gratitude, and the invisible foundations that support comfortable lives. The decision crystallized not in anger but in the painful clarity that comes when a father realizes his child has learned all the wrong lessons from a lifetime of careful instruction, when financial success has replaced character development, when professional achievement has become more important than basic human decency toward the person who made that achievement possible. I wasn't planning revenge, Revenge would have been cutting him out of my will, selling my properties and donating everything to charity, disappearing from his life entirely and letting him discover my worth only after my funeral when lawyers read documents that revealed what his unbearable burden had actually built for him. This was something different, something more surgical and educational, a demonstration that would force him to confront the reality of our relationship without destroying the future I'd still planned to give him, a lesson that would hurt but heal, break but rebuild, shock but ultimately enlighten. That evening I called James Patterson, my attorney for the past 18 years, and arranged an emergency meeting for the following morning, explaining only that I needed to review some property documents and explore certain legal options that might affect family dynamics without going into the emotional details that had brought me to this decision. James had handled everything from my initial business incorporation to Margaret's estate planning, so he understood the complexity of my holdings better than anyone, but he also understood discretion, which was why I trusted him with confidential matters that could affect multiple generations of my family's financial security. The plan that emerged from our conversation was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. I would exercise purchase options I'd held for years on properties that directly affected Michael's daily life, beginning with the office building that housed Henderson, Matthews and Associates, and extending to other strategic acquisitions that would demonstrate the scope of my actual influence in the business community where he'd built his professional identity. The genius of the strategy was that everything would be completely legal, entirely within my rights as a property owner and investor, but would simultaneously reveal the hidden connections between my small-time construction business and the sophisticated commercial infrastructure that supported his white-collar lifestyle. James initially tried to talk me out of what he diplomatically called dramatic gestures that might complicate family relationships, suggesting instead that we arrange a private meeting where I could simply show Michael the portfolio documents and explain my actual net worth without the theatrics of public demonstration. But I knew my son well enough to understand that private conversations had become meaningless between us. He'd learned to tune out my voice the way adults ignore background noise, nodding politely while planning his next response instead of actually listening to what I was trying to communicate. This required something that couldn't be dismissed or rationalized away, something that would force him to see me clearly for the first time in decades, even if that clarity came at the cost of temporary shock and discomfort. The hardest part of the planning was maintaining clarity about my motivations. This wasn't about humiliating Michael the way he'd humiliated me, wasn't about proving I was more successful than he'd assumed, wasn't about demanding apologies or extracting some kind of emotional tribute for years of unappreciated sacrifice. This was about forcing a conversation that we should have had years earlier, about creating a moment of recognition that might salvage our relationship before it deteriorated beyond repair, about demonstrating that love sometimes requires uncomfortable truths when comfortable lies have failed to produce the mutual respect that healthy families require. By midnight, the legal wheels were in motion. James would spend the night preparing documents, making calls to property managers and banking contacts, arranging the kind of rapid commercial transactions that were possible only when you had sufficient capital and established relationships within the local real estate community. Tomorrow, Michael would discover that his unbearable burden of a father was actually the silent partner in almost every aspect of his professional and personal life, and that realization would either destroy our relationship forever or rebuild it on a foundation of honest understanding rather than comfortable delusions about who owed what to whom in the complicated mathematics of family love. 40 years of sacrifice was about to speak louder than words ever could, and Wednesday morning began with a series of phone calls that would transform theoretical wealth into undeniable reality, starting with Tom Bradley at First National Bank, who'd been handling my commercial loans since 1987 and understood that when Walter Harrison requested immediate liquidity for a major acquisition, the request came with 4 decades of proven financial reliability behind it. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was sitting in the same kitchen where I'd taught Michael to tie his shoes, now orchestrating financial maneuvers that would fundamentally alter his understanding of everything he thought he knew about his father's capabilities and influence in the business community where he'd built his professional identity. Tom's voice carried the respectful tone that successful bankers reserve for their most valuable clients when he confirmed that transferring $8.2 million from my investment accounts to cover the Chase Tower purchase would be processed by noon, with additional credit lines available if I decided to expand the demonstration beyond the single property that housed his law firm. James Patterson arrived at 9 with a briefcase full of documents that transformed abstract legal concepts into concrete reality. purchase agreements, transfer deeds, liability releases, and tax implications that would make yesterday's restaurant humiliation seem like a minor social awkwardness compared to the professional earthquake I was about to trigger in Michael's carefully constructed world. The process of buying a building while your son was inside it, working at his desk and billing hours to clients who had no idea their office space was about to change ownership, required a level of emotional detachment I'd never needed for ordinary business transactions, forcing me to compartmentalize my role as a father while executing my responsibilities as a strategic property investor. We spent 2 hours reviewing every legal detail, every potential complication, every possible way this demonstration could backfire and damage our relationship permanently instead of shocking it back to health. But James finally agreed that all the paperwork was solid and the financial mechanisms were in place for a transaction that was both perfectly legal and absolutely devastating in its implications for family dynamics. The hardest part was maintaining normal routines while coordinating this elaborate revelation, answering Margaret's sister when she called to discuss Thanksgiving dinner plans, pretending to care about weather forecasts when the meteorological conditions that really mattered were the emotional storms that would erupt when Michael discovered his father's true net worth and business influence. I drove to the Cedar Falls hardware store, where I'd been shopping for supplies since 1979, and bought paint for my kitchen renovation project, engaging in small talk with Danny Morrison behind the counter while mentally calculating that the building we were standing in was worth less than the interest I earned monthly on my commercial property portfolio. The mundane normalcy of buying paintbrushes and asking about primer recommendations felt surreal when contrasted with the financial transactions happening simultaneously through secure phone calls and encrypted document transfers that would append my son's entire understanding of his family's place in the local economic hierarchy. By afternoon, the mechanisms were all in motion. Henderson, Matthews, and Associates would receive official notification that their landlord had changed, though the building management company would handle routine communications to avoid immediate recognition of my involvement, giving me time to orchestrate the personal revelation in whatever way would maximize educational impact while minimizing permanent relationship damage. The strangest part was how calm I felt, how centered and purposeful, after months of feeling dismissed and irrelevant in my son's increasingly sophisticated life. This wasn't the desperate flailing of a man trying to prove his worth, but the quiet confidence of someone who'd always possessed more power than he'd chosen to display, more influence than he'd needed to advertise, more substantive accomplishments than his critics had bothered to investigate. Standing in my garage that evening, surrounded by tools I'd used to build my first rental properties and photographs documenting 4 decades of commercial development projects, I realized that tomorrow would either mark the beginning of an honest relationship with my son or the definitive end of our pretense that mutual respect was possible when one person systematically undervalued everything the other person had sacrificed to create the foundation for their shared family legacy. Money can't buy respect, but it can demand attention, and Thursday at 2:47 p.m., according to the timestamp on my phone, Michael called me for the first time in 3 months without being prompted by holiday obligations or family emergencies, his voice carrying the kind of shocked confusion that occurs when reality collides violently with long-held assumptions about how the world actually works. "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," he began, and I could hear papers rustling in the background along with the muted conversations of his law office colleagues, the same professional environment where he'd built his identity as a successful attorney independent of his father's influence. The building management company had delivered the ownership transfer notification exactly as James Patterson had orchestrated, official, businesslike, impossible to ignore, and Michael had apparently spent the morning making phone calls to confirm what the documents seemed to be telling him about the true identity of his firm's new landlord. "Is it true that you own this building? Not just invested in it or have some small stake, but actually own the entire 32-story office complex where I've been working for the past 8 years?" His tone wasn't angry yet, just bewildered, like someone trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces didn't fit together in any configuration that made sense given everything he thought he knew about his father's financial situation and business capabilities. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of Cedar Falls Feed and Grain, where I'd stopped to buy birdseed for Margaret's old bird feeders, and chose my words carefully because this conversation would determine whether my dramatic gesture accomplished its educational purpose or simply drove the final wedge between us that made reconciliation impossible. "Yes, Michael, I own Chase Tower through Harrison Development LLC, have owned it for 6 years now, Bought it when the previous owners were facing foreclosure during the commercial real estate downturn, and your firm's lease payments have been contributing to my monthly income since you made partner and moved to the 32nd floor." The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to count 17 cars passing on Main Street, each one representing a normal Thursday afternoon in a small Indiana town where fathers and sons didn't usually conduct conversations about multi-million-dollar property transactions that revealed decades of hidden wealth and influence. When Michael finally spoke, his voice had changed, become smaller somehow, like he was processing information that challenged fundamental assumptions about his own success story. "How much? I mean, what else? Dad, what exactly do you own that I don't know about?" The question opened a door I'd been trying to open for years through subtler methods that had failed to penetrate his professional arrogance and social climbing ambitions, and I realized this moment was either going to heal our relationship or destroy it completely, depending on how I handled the revelation of just how wrong he'd been about everything. "I own 47 commercial properties across 6 states, Michael, generating about $2.8 million annually in rental income, plus investment accounts worth another $12 million, which means that your unbearable burden of a father has been quietly building generational wealth while you've been describing me to your friends as someone who does small-time construction." I could hear him breathing, could almost feel him trying to reconcile this information with years of dismissive comments about my career, with restaurant conversations where he described me as an embarrassment, with his wife's family's casual condescension toward my blue-collar background that he'd never bothered to correct. "But why didn't you ever tell me? Why let me think? Why let me say those things about your work when you knew?" He trailed off, perhaps beginning to understand that the answer to his question was more complicated and painful than simple information sharing, that my silence had been a gift he'd never recognized and certainly never appreciated. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering practical questions about business structures and legal entities, but the real communication was happening in the spaces between words, in his growing realization that his father wasn't the man he'd thought he was, and more importantly, that he wasn't the self-made success story he'd believed himself to be, but rather the beneficiary of carefully orchestrated family wealth that had been supporting his lifestyle in ways he'd never bothered to investigate or acknowledge. That's when he realized I wasn't the one who needed to prove my worth, and Friday evening Michael appeared at my front door without calling first, something he hadn't done since college. Standing on the porch Margaret had helped me design in 1994, with a manila envelope in his hands and tears in his eyes that I hadn't seen since he was 12 and his dog died. He looked older somehow, like the past 36 hours had aged him in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion, and when I opened the door he didn't wait for an invitation but walked straight to the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals during his childhood, placed the envelope between us, and said, "I spent all night going through every document I could find, every property record, every business filing, trying to understand how I could have been so completely wrong about
everything."
The envelope contained printouts he'd obviously gathered from multiple sources: county recorder's office property transfers showing my name on dozens of commercial deals dating back to the 1980s, Indiana Secretary of State business filings revealing the scope of Harrison Development's corporate structure, even newspaper articles from business journals that had featured my company over the years. Articles I'd never mentioned because he'd never shown interest in reading them. "Dad, I found a 1997 article in Indiana Business Monthly that called you one of the Midwest's most successful small market developers, and it mentions that you were already worth 8 figures 25 years ago, which means—" He stopped talking and put his head in his hands, and I realized he was crying the way men cry when they've discovered something about themselves that they can't bear to acknowledge but can't find a way to deny. "Which means you were already incredibly successful when I graduated from high school, when I went to college, when I got married, when I made partner, and I've spent 15 years treating you like an embarrassment instead of recognizing that everything I've accomplished was built on the foundation you created before I was even old enough to understand what financial security actually means." His voice broke completely on the last sentence, and suddenly he wasn't the arrogant attorney who'd called me an unbearable burden, but my son, the boy who used to climb on my lap and ask me to explain how skyscrapers stayed standing against the wind, and I felt something crack open in my chest that I'd been protecting since that restaurant conversation. "I called Jennifer after I found these documents," he continued, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand in a gesture that transported me back 30 years to similar conversations about playground fights and broken friendships, and I told her about the property portfolio, about the rental income, about the fact that we've been living in a house whose mortgage you helped us qualify for because you co-signed the loan through one of your business entities, and she just sat there in silence for 20 minutes before saying, "Michael, your father has been subsidizing our entire lifestyle, and you've been treating him like a charity case." The weight of recognition was crushing him, and I could see him trying to process not just the financial revelations but the psychological implications of spending years dismissing someone whose quiet generosity had made his comfortable existence possible. The worst part is remembering every conversation where I described you as small-time or semi-retired or just someone who does construction, and realizing that I wasn't just wrong about the facts. I was wrong about your character, your intelligence, your business acumen, everything that actually matters about who you are as a person. He pulled out his phone and showed me a screenshot of the Henderson, Matthews and Associates building directory, pointing to the management company contact information that now listed Harrison Properties as the ownership entity. I walked through our office building this morning looking at everything differently. The marble lobby, the high-end elevators, the conference rooms with city views, and realized my father owns all of it, has owned it for years while I've been working inside it completely oblivious to the fact that my rent payments were going to support the man I'd been systematically disrespecting for having no understanding of professional environments. The irony was suffocating him, and I watched my son confront the reality that his professional identity had been built inside a structure created by the father he'd dismissed as irrelevant to his success, that his career advancement had literally taken place within the walls of my investment portfolio while he criticized my lack of sophistication and business knowledge. I didn't buy his house to hurt him. I bought it to save our relationship, and sitting across from Michael at that kitchen table where Margaret had served him thousands of meals with love and patience I was still learning to demonstrate. I realized this moment required the kind of brutal honesty that most fathers and sons never risk because the truth about family dynamics is often more painful than the comfortable lies we tell ourselves to avoid confronting how far we've drifted from genuine connection. Son, I need you to understand something that's going to be harder to hear than any property ownership revelation or financial disclosure. I've been subsidizing your entire adult life not because you needed the help, but because I was terrified that without my financial support, you'd have no reason to maintain any relationship with me at all. The words came out in a rush, 43 years of suppressed fear and carefully hidden vulnerability spilling across the table like water breaking through a dam that had been holding back decades of accumulated emotional pressure. Every college tuition payment, every down payment assistance, every wedding expense, every emergency fund transfer, none of it was about money, Michael. It was about staying relevant in your world, about maintaining some kind of connection to a son who was growing more successful and sophisticated every year while his father remained stuck in Cedar Falls, Indiana, building strip malls and worrying that his blue-collar origins would eventually become too embarrassing for you to acknowledge in your professional circles. I watched him process this information, saw him beginning to understand that my financial generosity hadn't been simple paternal love but something more complex and desperate, the calculated strategy of a man who'd confused providing with parenting and discovered too late that you can't buy your way into someone's respect or affection. When you called me an unbearable burden at that restaurant, you weren't just insulting my pride or hurting my feelings. You were confirming my worst fear about what I'd become in your life, the embarrassing reminder of your humble beginnings that you tolerated out of obligation rather than welcomed out of genuine affection. The admission cost me something essential, stripping away the dignity I'd tried to maintain throughout this entire ordeal and revealing the pathetic truth that successful fathers rarely acknowledge. Sometimes love becomes indistinguishable from bribery when you're desperate enough to maintain connection with children who've outgrown their need for your protection or guidance. I didn't buy Chase Tower to demonstrate my wealth or prove my business acumen or embarrass you in front of your colleagues. I bought it because I was running out of ways to get your attention, because subtle hints about my success weren't penetrating the assumptions you'd made about my limitations, because I'd reached the point where shocking you seemed like the only strategy left for forcing an honest conversation about who we actually are to each other versus who we've been pretending to be.
For the past decade.
Michael's face was a study in devastation as he realized that his father's dramatic gesture hadn't been motivated by wounded pride or vindictive anger, but by the desperate love of a man who'd been willing to risk destroying their relationship entirely rather than watch it continue deteriorating through polite indifference and systematic disrespect. The house purchase I mentioned, that wasn't a threat, Michael, it was a promise. Not a promise to hurt you, but a promise to myself that I wouldn't spend my remaining years being treated like a charity case by the person I'd spent my entire adult life trying to support, protect, and prepare for a successful future. I pulled out my own envelope, containing documents he hadn't seen yet, the will and trust structures that would transfer everything to him regardless of how this conversation ended, the life insurance policies that would ensure his financial security even if our relationship never recovered from this confrontation, the detailed letters of instruction I'd written explaining every business decision and investment strategy so that he'd understand his inheritance even if he never understood his father. Everything I've built belongs to you eventually, son. The properties, the investment accounts, the business entities. It's all designed to support your family for generations, whether you respect the man who created it or continue seeing him as an embarrassment you're obligated to manage until death releases you from that burden. The cruelest irony was that in trying to secure his love through financial provision, I'd actually made it easier for him to dismiss me, because people rarely value what they didn't have to work for, and children especially struggle to appreciate sacrifices they never witnessed or understood as necessary for their comfort and security. Healing takes time, but understanding can happen in a moment, and over the following months Michael and I began the slow, imperfect process of rebuilding a relationship that had been damaged by decades of mutual misunderstanding, unrealistic expectations, and the kind of pride that prevents families from having honest conversations until crisis forces them to confront uncomfortable truths about love, respect, and the complex mathematics of generational sacrifice. The changes weren't dramatic or immediate. There was no magical reconciliation scene where all wounds healed instantly, no tearful embrace that erased years of accumulated resentment and disappointment, but rather a gradual shift in how we approached each other, like two people learning to speak a common language after years of talking past each other in dialects that sounded similar but carried completely different meanings. Michael started calling more frequently, not with the dutiful obligation that had characterized our previous interactions, but with genuine questions about business decisions, property management strategies, and investment philosophy that suggested he was finally interested in understanding rather than merely tolerating his father's professional expertise. Our conversations became longer, more substantive, moving beyond weather reports and health updates to discussions about economic trends, local development projects, and the kind of strategic thinking that had built Harrison Development from a $5,000 bank loan into a multi-generational wealth creation engine. He began including me in family decisions in ways that felt authentic rather than perfunctory, asking for advice about refinancing their mortgage, requesting introductions to contractors when they decided to renovate their kitchen, even inviting me to Jennifer's art museum fundraiser where he introduced me to his colleagues not as someone who does construction, but as my father, who owns Harrison Development and has been one of Indiana's most successful commercial real estate developers for the past 4 decades. The shift in Jennifer's attitude was perhaps more surprising than Michael's transformation. She started asking thoughtful questions about my business philosophy, expressing genuine interest in hearing stories about the early years of building my company, and even requesting advice about her own investment portfolio in ways that suggested she was beginning to see me as a resource rather than an obligation. But the healing wasn't linear or complete. There were still moments when old patterns reasserted themselves, when Michael would catch himself beginning to dismiss something I'd said before stopping mid-sentence and asking me to continue, when I would retreat into protective silence instead of engaging with his questions because 40 years of being undervalued had created defensive habits that didn't disappear overnight just because the underlying dynamic had changed. We had to learn new ways of being father and son, ways that acknowledged both his professional success and my business achievements without either of us feeling diminished by the other's accomplishments, ways that honored his independence while recognizing my continued relevance in his life beyond mere financial support. The most difficult conversations involved addressing the years of accumulated hurt, Michael's shame about how he'd described me to his friends and colleagues, my regret about staying silent when I should have demanded respect, both of us grappling with the realization that love without mutual respect becomes a kind of emotional charity that ultimately damages both the giver and receiver. We established new boundaries and expectations. I would share more information about my business activities rather than maintaining the mysterious silence that had allowed him to underestimate my capabilities, and he would include me in family discussions and social events as an equal participant rather than an elderly relative to be managed politely until he could escape to more interesting company. The process was messy, sometimes painful, frequently awkward as we navigated the transition from our old dynamic to something healthier but unfamiliar, like learning to dance together after years of stepping on each other's feet because neither person understood the rhythm the other was trying to follow. 6 months after the Chase Tower revelation, we were having lunch at the same restaurant where he'd called me an unbearable burden, but this time the conversation centered around his questions about expanding Harrison development into renewable energy projects and his ideas about incorporating environmental sustainability into our existing property portfolio. Discussions that would have been impossible when he saw me as an embarrassing reminder of his blue-collar origins rather than a business partner whose expertise could complement his legal knowledge in mutually beneficial ways. Love doesn't demand perfection. It demands presence and respect, and sitting here 2 years later in the same kitchen where this entire journey began, I understand that the most expensive lesson I ever taught my son had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the fundamental truth that family relationships require the same intentional maintenance as any other valuable investment you hope to preserve for future generations. The Chase Tower purchase wasn't really about demonstrating my wealth or proving my business acumen. It was about forcing both of us to confront the reality that we'd allowed assumptions, pride, and generational misunderstanding to erode something that should have been unbreakable. The bond between a father who'd spent 40 years building security for his family and a son who'd never learned to recognize sacrifice when it was offered quietly, without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. Michael and I still have our difficult moments, still occasionally fall back into old patterns of communication that reflect decades of talking past each other rather than to each other, but we've learned something that most families never discover until it's too late. Respect isn't automatically inherited along with eye color and genetic predispositions, but must be earned and maintained through honest conversation, mutual recognition, and the willingness to see each other as complete human beings rather than simplified roles that fit comfortably into our existing narratives about family dynamics. The hardest lesson for both of us was understanding that love without respect becomes a form of emotional charity that ultimately diminishes both the giver and receiver. I'd been giving financial support while silently resenting his lack of appreciation, and he'd been accepting that support while unconsciously resenting what he perceived as my attempts to remain relevant in his increasingly sophisticated world. We were both wrong, both right, both struggling with the universal challenge that defines every parent-child relationship: how to maintain connection across generational differences while honoring each other's autonomy, achievements, and fundamental human dignity. The truth that emerged from our crisis was simultaneously simple and profound. Children need to understand the full scope of their parents' sacrifices not to create guilt or obligation, but to develop the empathy that transforms family relationships from duty-based interactions into genuine partnerships built on mutual respect and shared understanding of how much love actually costs when it's expressed through decades of consistent action rather than periodic emotional declarations. Parents, meanwhile, need to share their struggles and achievements openly rather than protecting their children from reality in ways that make those children incapable of recognizing or appreciating the foundation that supports their comfortable existence. My mistake wasn't building wealth for Michael's future. It was hiding the process, the stress, the sacrifice, and the strategic thinking that wealth creation required, leaving him unable to understand or value what I'd accomplished because I'd made it invisible in my effort to shield him from the anxiety and uncertainty that had motivated my ambition. His mistake wasn't being successful or ambitious. It was assuming that his achievements were entirely self-generated rather than recognizing how generational wealth transfer had created opportunities that most people his age could never access, regardless of their intelligence, work ethic, or professional competence. The reconciliation between us required both of us to abandon comfortable fictions about family dynamics and confront uncomfortable truths about respect, gratitude, and the complex mathematics of love that extends beyond emotional connection to encompass practical support, strategic planning, and the kind of long-term thinking that builds security for people who may never fully understand the cost of that security until they're forced to provide it for their own children. If this story made you think about your own family, tell me in the comments. What's something your parents sacrificed that you only understood years later? And parents, What do you wish your children knew about your struggles? Let's heal these family wounds together, because love doesn't demand perfection. It demands presence and respect. Don't forget to subscribe, because this old father has more stories about the price of pride and the power of understanding, stories about what happens when families choose honesty over harmony and discover that real peace can only be built on foundations of mutual recognition rather than comfortable avoidance of difficult conversations that might reveal how much we still have to learn about loving each other well.